Welcome into the HoosierIllustrated.com postgame wrap-up show. John Alden from In Touch with Indiana Sports and Drew Rosenberg from Talking About the Hoosiers and staff writer for HoosierIllustrated.com. The Indiana Hoosiers football program is now 6-0. They are the first team in FBS college football to reach bowl eligibility. This is the dream scenario, as I just put out on Twitter a few minutes ago, that myself, Kyler, maybe I don't know how much you humored it, Drew, but I know that I like to toy with the potential of Indiana to make it to 6-0 with the path that was laid out in front of them. And here they are halfway through the season going into the bye week, and they've done exactly that.
Yeah, I mean, you looked at the schedule when it came out at the start of the year and you're like, all right, it's a very inviting schedule. I mean, a lot of winnable games early, and Indiana took care of business through 6 games. It's exactly what you wanted from Curt Cignetti. I mean, it's been, national media everywhere, the Google me, I win, but clearly he does it. He's turned every single program around immediately. I think there was a graphic talking about first year comparisons in 3-9 last year, 6-0 already. So at the worst case, he doubled the win total from last year.
And I heard one of the Big Ten Network folks, people, whatever you want to call them, broadcasters, play-by-play guys, mentioned that I believe this is Indiana's 5th game so far this year, 5th in a row, because the first one, the one that didn't meet this threshold, was the opening game of the season, where they find a way to pass the 40-point threshold. This team can score. This team just – one thing, I've compared this Curt Cignetti team to Kevin Wilson teams of the past, but the biggest difference is the defense has a lot more of an identity than any of those Kevin Wilson teams ever had. And this defense does have some holes. This is one of the first games this year. Not one of the first. It's the second game in a row, really, where we've seen the defense really get tested at times. But every single moment where Northwestern was able to kind of get momentum for themselves, Indiana found a way to respond almost immediately after. And I feel like every time we've seen Indiana in those situations throughout every game so far this season, which there's not been a ton. There was a couple in UCLA. There was a brief moment in the second quarter of the Charlotte game. And then there was a lot of back and forth in the Maryland game. And then obviously you have today. We've seen Indiana respond pretty much every time that their back gets put against the wall against any of these teams they played against so far.
Yeah, it's a killer instinct. It's something that this team clearly has. I mean, you looked at the game, 3-point lead, all the momentum Northwestern, big 3rd and 5. Curtis Rourke finds Elijah Surratt for a big first down. And then from there, 10-play, 75-yard drive for a touchdown to go back up 10. It's that killer instinct, though, because Indiana teams of the past, they don't score on that drive. They go 3 and out. They get stopped. And the momentum of the game completely flips. But Curt Cignetti has instilled in his players, it's that killer belief. It's that step on their throat. Go for the jugular, as Cignetti has said. It's a big change for the program.
No turnovers in this game after a really turnover-prone game last week from Indiana, especially from Curtis Rourke. He didn't play a perfect game, but he made a lot of really good decisions through 3 touchdown passes, and he is, without question, probably the best leader, especially when it comes to the offensive side of the ball, that Indiana has had. I mean, I don't want to say of all time because, again, we have to see how the rest of the season plays out. But definitely in the last, I would say, 10 to 20 years, you couldn't ask for a better quarterback to be fronting this Indiana football team like Curtis Rourke.
Yeah, cool, calm, and collected. It's the way that I describe him. Every single time, it's always next play. He might miss a throw, but if he misses a throw, it doesn't matter. He's thrown that play away. He's already on to the next play. And it's kind of been the identity, I feel like, for this team, even when everything goes wrong, which, sometimes, especially on defense today, there was times everything went wrong. It didn't matter because Rourke was still locked in, focused, no turnovers from the offensive group. And even when there was a bad snap, Rourke, ball on the ground, easily could have panicked, jumped on it, made the veteran play, didn't try to do too much with it.
Yeah, I guess we're moving forward. Indiana is at the halfway point of the season. I mean, I think ideally, if you're a program that's winning and things are going your way, you love to have now there's 2 bye weeks, but you love to have one of the bye weeks be exactly in the midway point of the season, especially when you look how it sets up for Indiana. You have, again, the midway point, as I mentioned, but you have a Nebraska team coming to town the following week for homecoming. You have Hoosier Hysteria taking place that Friday as well. This should, without a doubt, be the best environment that Memorial Stadium has. Again, I don't know if I want to say has ever seen, but if you go back the last 10 to 20 years, this should without a doubt be one of the most electric homecoming crowds that Bloomington's ever experienced whenever they take the field again in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and it's the one game I can kind of think of in comparison is the Cincinnati game from 2021.
That's a good choice.
But it's really the environment. I mean, we've talked so much about the emails Signetti sent out to the students. I mean, I'd be shocked if it's not completely sold out homecoming. I know a lot of alumni are coming in. Nebraska's a good football team. I know they lost Illinois, and I don't know if
currently playing Rutgers right now. That game's still in progress. I do believe they were up on Rutgers. I'm trying to pull up that score right now. Again, some of you who may be watching this in retrospect, the game will be over by then. But yeah, currently in the fourth quarter, Nebraska blanking Rutgers 14-0. Yeah. So Nebraska will likely be coming into this Indiana game. Actually, do they have a bye next week?
Yes.
Let me take a look. Yeah, so both Nebraska and Indiana on their bye weeks at the exact same time. Nebraska will have some stuff on the line when they come in town to face Indiana. They'll be going for their first to achieve bowl eligibility for the first time, and I believe 10 to 15 years, something along those lines. So they'll be playing for something for sure. And of course, it's Nebraska. They're always going to be reaching for high heights, if you will. But this is going to be a highly competitive game from both sides. I don't know whether we should expect big noon kickoff or college game day to be involved here, but this is a critical point in the season coming up really for both teams as that matchup takes place here in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it was a game I kind of was like, okay, possibly could have game day on the schedule, but if I'm not mistaken, I think you have Georgia, Texas that week. And
plus one thing too we have to keep in mind is with the network affiliations, the ESPN game day crew is almost always going to favor SEC, ACC, or Big 12 games before they ever choose a Big 10 game, or I would say a Pac-12 game, but that doesn't exist anymore. But I'd say regardless, you're going to see one of the big networks highlighting the game taking place in Bloomington in a couple of weeks, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if you saw, but on the Pat McAfee's podcast, he talked about how he wants to get back to Bloomington. I think he was saying there had been game day one time in Bloomington. It was a Thursday kickoff.
Yeah, it was a very weird game day. It was the opening night of college football. It was actually Tom Allen's very first game as permanent head coach with the Hoosiers. I guess, or I don't know if they count his game where he coached the bowl game as his permanent start or not, but his first game with the full season with Indiana, that against Ohio State too. So, and it wasn't your traditional game day where they had, the students in the back. I don't even remember where they had the studio set up at, but to even know that could be a possibility just shows how far that the Indiana program has already come in 1 year under Signetti.
For sure. I mean, it's a culture change. It's not just obviously they're winning on the football field, but it's a mentality that they're winning with is the biggest thing I think I've noticed. Even Tom Allen's, the 2020 season, Indiana football was great. They were a really good team, top 12, even with Penix getting hurt midway through that year. But it still wasn't like this. They were winning close games, tough games. But this Indiana football is putting teams away, even if it's close late in the fourth quarter. I think it was a 3-point game with 11 minutes left in the game today. 8 minutes later, the game's 17-point lead for Indiana.
And one thing that I reference a lot on my show, and I don't really know how good of a metric this truly is. I mean, so far it's proved to be fairly accurate, but early on in the year, if you looked way ahead at the ESPN FPI predictors for Indiana's schedule, there was a point where Indiana was favored in 10 of 12 games, and that slowly changed to 11 of 12 games, including a win over Michigan at home. And again, I don't foresee any scenario changing where Indiana somehow becomes favored against Ohio State on the road unless they just end up imploding at some point in the next several games, which I highly doubt. But the college football playoff, as much as it seems like that should be blasphemous for a program like Indiana, that is something that is truly on the table right now for this Indiana team. If they're able to do what they're supposed to do, and at this point, they will be favored against Nebraska in 2 weeks. They should be favored against Washington the week after that, on the road at Michigan State. While that will be tough with the spittoon rivalry, they will be favored in that game if they continue to take care of business against these other teams that we're talking about. And then you have the 3-game gauntlet, and maybe the Purdue game isn't so much of a gauntlet considering how bad they've been so far this year. It is still the bucket game. But I do love how it sets up at the very end of the season. You have all 3 teams that Curt Cignetti called out during his announcement, if you will, or his introduction to the fans at Simon Scott Assembly Hall nearly a year ago. You play all 3 of those teams back to back, Michigan, Ohio State, and Purdue. I mean, it could potentially set up for a very theatrical end to the season if Indiana is able to take care of business the next few weeks ahead of them.
Yeah, I want to go back to a point you made earlier talking about the bye weeks. Indiana's bye weeks could not have come at better spots. Through 6 games, you get one right at the midway point, and then you get one after this 4-game stretch. You get one right before Ohio State and Purdue. It's a really good spot to be in, and you mentioned you have 4 games coming up, which are all like at the beginning of the year, you probably weren't going to say Michigan was a very winnable game. This Michigan team can't throw the football on offense. They'll have a chance to prove it tonight against Washington, but Michigan has not looked good offensively, and the way Indiana's scored, they should be able to put up some points. I mean, I know Michigan's defense is very, very good, but at the same time, that is a game that's now become, all right, they can actually win this game.
Yeah, and I don't want to say, I mean, maybe some people would say I've been a hater on Michigan. I have said since day one that I think Sharon Moore is going to end up not working out at Michigan. I didn't necessarily mean that was going to happen immediately, but they have looked, I mean, they're not what they were with Jim Harbaugh, of course. And then there's also a little asterisk next to that when you factor in all of the Connor Stallions nonsense that took place the last few years. So how good is Michigan really? We're kind of finding out so far this year that they can be competitive with some of the more elite teams. They got that win against USC, of course, and they do have a very elite ground game that will be tough to stop no matter who they're facing or going up against. But again, that's still several weeks down the road. But again, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the fact that these conversations are even happening is stuff that I think the only time that people may have ever humored these types of things in the last few years was the year that was coming up after the 2020 season where there were expectations. Now, not a single one of those expectations were met. You ended up going 2-10, and it really ended up being the opposite of this year, which was the worst case scenario, and all of the momentum that you had completely taken out of the balloon. But again, that is now way in the past because this is Curt Cignetti's Indiana, and I'm hoping that the fans are enjoying this while they have it. And I'm not saying that Cignetti will immediately jump ship to a different program, but you have to think that no matter what happens at this point, his name is going to be a very, very hot commodity by the time you get to the end of this year.
Yeah, it's something I've really thought about because I don't know. It's like a mixed bag because normally a coach in Cignetti's situation, they get a chance to go to a bigger program and it happens every single time. Hopefully Scott Dolson can lock him up to a massive contract like he was able to do with Tom Allen, which, turned out not to be the best move in the end. But at the time, you had to do it. But it's weird just because Cignetti's an older coach. 63, I want to say.
Yeah, he's 63. Turned 63 this past offseason, I should say.
And he talked about how he expected to retire at James Madison. So it's one of those things you don't know how much in his head does he want to move to another school after only 1 year, or does he say, okay, I can get a bigger job because there's going to be jobs available. I think Florida is very likely to fire Billy Napier. And Florida is a very enticing job, especially with, blanking on the quarterback, DJ Lagway, 5-star freshman, really talented quarterback that, could be something that intrigues Cignetti to jump ship. But these are all hypotheticals.
Yeah.
And
I want to throw one, with it being the bye week, you do tend to see sometimes things like extensions. if that were to happen at any point mid-season, this upcoming week may be the year that you see that. And or maybe it's not the year, the time that you see that, I should say. And I'm not necessarily saying that will be the case, but do not be surprised if later on in the next several days you do see something come out, because this would be really kind of an ideal time to double down on your commitment to Cignetti after you've seen what he's been able to do with the program. Now, again, you hope it doesn't kind of follow the trend of things turning downward after you make that type of investment, because it doesn't just happen in Indiana. I feel like there are plenty of examples where once you give the head coach that you covet so much what they seem to deserve, there are numerous moments, and again, not just with Indiana, where that ends up biting you in the ass. So, but at the same time, what do you have to lose right now if you're Indiana? You know what I mean? Like, you do have a lot to lose. You haven't lost it all. But at the same time, what harm would it do to not double down? Because there is a chance that you do lose them if that's not the case.
And wow, I mean, the Tom Allen, extension didn't end up working out at the end. Indiana's a big enough school where you do have the boosters, you do have the alumni support, that if, everything goes wrong after a huge extension, they've shown they're willing to pay the amount of money to get a guy out of here and get someone new in. So it's one of those things. It's obviously a double-edged sword. You don't want to, cripple your budget by doing it, and then you're stuck with a coach that maybe is not great. But Cignetti's, he's consistently been good every single place he's been, and it's gotten better each year with him. And this is only year one, so I don't see why it would turn bad. It's one of those things you never know. Pandora's box.
He is now one win away from officially continuing his streak of never having a losing season. He can have a 500 year, and then I guess technically a losing season if you lose out and then lose your bowl game.
Yeah.
But that's definitely not. And that's one other thing that I want to bring up before we wrap this up. Curt Cignetti said this at Big Ten Football Media Days, that a 6-6 season was bullshit. And I think just based on the results that you see right now, that was never the goal in mind for somebody like Curt Cignetti. And the sky's the limit right now. I don't think there's a reason to think that they'll be 12-0, because it'll be very tough to win in Ohio State on the road, but that could end up being a lot more contested, competitive matchup than anybody would have ever expected at the beginning of the season. So, Drew, before we wrap things up, what are some of your final thoughts, whether it be on this game, how the season's going, what's coming up? Go and let people know.
I have two. I want to just add on to your point there. Curt Cignetti, I mean this is a compliment to Curt Cignetti, but he's a psycho, and it's in his head. Something is in his head that he believes Indiana's going to go 13, 15, 16-0 and win the national championship this year. And it's what you want in a coach. You said it. 6-6 is bullshit. Normally, a guy gets in the Indiana program, they're like, yeah, that was a great year one, great job. That's not Cignetti. He has that different mindset it's the Saban mindset. Everything needs to be perfect, and great isn't good enough. You got to be better. But the real point I want to make from this game is Waffle House, Elijah Surratt.
Yeah.
He's lived up to the name. He gave himself the nickname, which, usually doesn't go well for you. 7 for 135 and made big play after big play down the stretch when Indiana needed it. There was times he wasn't open, that 3rd and 5 I mentioned with Northwestern having come the game to 3. He wasn't open on that play, but he made a great body catch with a defender all over him, and it's what he's done all year for Indiana.
You talk about not giving yourself that nickname, but he's kind of taken a page out of the Cignetti playbook, kind of bragging on himself whenever he doesn't really need to be doing that. But, you think about the I win, Google me. That's kind of along those same lines as the Waffle House, I'm always open. So, if you're the players, you're going to take after your head coach more often than not. But it's been a fun ride so far this year for Indiana football. We're at halftime of the season, heading into the bye week, and we'll be back again in a couple of weeks to do the Nebraska postgame wrap-up show. And it's going to depend on what time the game ends up being in comparison to when the Louisville Cardinals football team plays, because most of my listeners know that I cover U of L as well. Not necessarily the same way that I do here with Indiana, but I do have obligations. I would love to be up at the Indiana-Nebraska game, and if I can make that work, then I'm absolutely going to do so. So
I'm in the same boat. kind of looking at flights, seeing if I can make it work, fly and get there for that game.
All right. For Drew, this has been another edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com post-game wrap-up show. Be sure to subscribe. Get us to 500 subscribers by Monday. We're really close. I believe we're maybe 15 away, maybe less than that by now. I'm not 100% sure. But get us to 500 by Monday. I'd really appreciate it. Give Drew a follow on Twitter. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can. I'm not sure what value that gives you. But if you want to, you can. And we'll do this all again in 2 weeks. In touch with Indiana sports, as always, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Talking about the Hoosiers. Will you all be back on Thursday next week?
Yes, yeah. I'm pretty sure we're going to do a basketball episode just with the bye week. Do a little preview after Big Ten Media Days. So I think maybe we have a mailbag coming up. So make sure you're following me, Alec Lastly, and Kyler, so you can get your questions in on Twitter before we do that episode.
Good stuff. Well, until next time, this has been another edition of the HoosierIllustrated.com post-game wrap-up show.